Hi, I'm Heidi Heitkamp, one of the founders of the One Country Project. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we're really excited to be back for the fourth annual One Country Progress or Rural Progress Summit. When Joe Donnelly and I founded One Country Project, we knew that rural America had undergone massive political and cultural changes over the last few decades. Those changes have had a profound impact on not just rural America, but the entire country. One Country Project is here to help provide rural America with informed policy choices, amplify the voices of our rural leaders, and blunt some of the political forces we believe are dividing our country. Over the next 3 days, we're going to bring you conversations to further that goal. We'll hear from elected leaders, industry leaders, policy experts addressing some of the key economic, social, and political issues impacting our rural America. Today, we're going to focus on policy impact of the Trump administration, the policy impact that the Trump administration is having on rural communities, as we discuss first Trump's trade war, the long-stalled farm bill and the future of the farm bill, the attack on public education, rural health care policy, and we're going to hear from former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg in our featured conversation. Now, I want to introduce you to our first topic and our first group of panelists, and that is our trade war panel. A topic that I spent a lot of time dealing with when I was in the United States Senate during the Trump administration's first term. So Donald Trump loves tariffs. In fact, he calls them tariffs man, and he corrected himself once and said, tariffs are the most beautiful word in the English language. Then he had to say maybe it was love, but tariffs were a close second. And no doubt why he would like that, because he has exercised emergency powers that essentially give him unilateral power to tax and punish whoever he believes needs punishment. And I suppose it's fitting that today is Tuesday, Taco Tuesday, as in Trump always chickens out day. You saw yesterday, and I hesitate to say where we are with tariffs right now because it seems to change every day, but we've now seen an extension from the big, beautiful tariffs, or as Trump called it, Liberation Day. But some countries who haven't been, I think, quick to kiss the ring are experiencing some threats right now of immediate action. I think the tariffs rates will jump to levels approaching and in some case exceeding what we saw in the 1930s and before that. To some, and we'll have a chance to visit with some economists, to some way of thinking helped lead us into the Great Depression. So to help us cut through some of the economic fog, we have a tremendous panel of experts to help understand where things currently stand and what's coming next, and what by all means for what all of this means for rural communities. Now I want to welcome our panel. Peter Friedmann is the executive director of the Agricultural Transportation Coalition. He has spent his career helping to craft policies that shape U.S. and international trade policies. Gary Wertish is president of the Minnesota Farmers Union and a neighbor to us here in North Dakota. He has served as the facilitator for the World Farmers Organization. Mike Espy served as Secretary of Agriculture for President Clinton and is in private practice as a lawyer and an agricultural advisor. He's part of our advisory committee for the Export-Import Bank, and most importantly, he's a member of the One Country Project Board of Directors. Jason Furman is a professor of practice at Harvard Kennedy School at the Department of Economics. He served as 8 years as an economic advisor to President Obama, and he is a member of several boards and organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations. And I will warn you all, if you decide to follow Jason on X, it will be a mini course in economics, because he is no spin. He gets right to what matters and what doesn't matter. But you will walk away from that experience, I think, incredibly informed. And so, Jason, we're going to start with you. President Trump's imposed the majority of tariffs using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Of course, have recently struck down that tariff as illegal, but there's been a stay on that during that time period. And Congress is trying to figure out what to do with the utilization of all these emergency powers. So if you look at what happens, and I don't want to give people false hope, because he has now signaled that he will use other authorities, maybe authorities that are more clearly identified with tariff restrictions and the sanction of tariffs. But where do you see the tariffs right now, basically legally, in terms of imposition of unilateral executive tariffs, but also economically? How are the markets responding to this level of disruption?
Yeah, so it's great to be with you, Senator, and I agreed with everything you said in your outstanding opening framing on this topic. I'm not a legal expert, but the legal statute that President Trump is using, IEPA, is grounded actually in an economic concept. It says that what you do must be based on an unusual and extraordinary threat that's emerging from outside the United States. And as an economist, I can tell you none of those apply here. The threat that he has identified is trade deficits. That's not unusual. Lots and lots of countries around the world have trade deficits. It's not extraordinary. It's been going on for decades. And this one is a little bit complicated economically, but the threat doesn't emerge from outside the United States. The reason we run a trade deficit is largely because of our own choices that we make here in the United States. Some of those are good choices. We're a really, really rich and successful economy. That means we tend to buy more imports. We invest a lot in economic growth. That also, requires us to borrow more from the rest of the world. But some of it is bad reasons, like the large budget deficit, which, by the way, is going to get even larger because of the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill that passed last week. So as an economist, I can say that the problem he's trying to solve is, first of all, not caused by other countries' tariffs. Second of all, won't be solved by our own tariffs. And third of all, is not at all obvious to me that it should be legal under the statute. But as you said, Senator Heitkamp, there's other legal authorities that he has if this one doesn't work. And the truth is, Congress has delegated a lot of its tariffing authority, way too much, in my view, of its tariffing authority to the president. And where that leaves us is with an extraordinary amount of uncertainty. Every day, tariff rates are changing on one country or another. That uncertainty itself is bad for the economy. The United States has leverage with some countries like the United Kingdom and Vietnam that we have deals with. But there's other countries we have much less leverage with. I would argue that China has more leverage over the United States through things like denying us rare earths that we desperately need than the opposite, although both countries have some leverage. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's not a great path to a deal with a lot of the different countries around the world. Some there are. And then finally, what this will mean is we're going to have higher inflation this year, slower growth. I don't think this is enough for a recession, but if we have slower growth, that means we're all collectively poorer because of this poorly thought out policy.
Yeah, I just want to make this point. When I was in the Senate and we saw this first round, whether it was 301 or, basically arguing that Canada was a national security threat, we basically tried to claw back some of that support, led by Jeff Flake and my friend Bob Corker and I, and a number of us said this is a power to tax that's unilaterally been delegated. And so I've looked at a lot of history, and one of the reasons why the president has this authority is because Congress didn't think that they would exercise it appropriately, that they would be much more parochial in terms of and protectionist. And so now you see these historic kind of transfers of power basically being exercised in ways that people never anticipated. And so these tariffs, I mean, I just want to kind of calibrate everybody because I'm also an old revenue commissioner. And I just want to kind of have you think about this because one thing that we don't talk about is the power to tariff and then the power to exclude certain industries from tariffs. And so, think about if the governor of your state had the power to set the sales tax rate at whatever sales tax rate that he or she wanted, and then the power to exempt industries that they liked or didn't like, keep it on industries they didn't like. And so this is a the power to tax historically has been the most significant exercise of governmental power, recognized since the Revolutionary War, and it's now being basically unilaterally utilized. And I think the kind of lack of understanding of the overall economy that Jason just explained, I think is leading to a lot of the kind of challenges going forward. And I want to just transition to you, Gary. Obviously, one of the reasons why I got so seriously involved is we were concerned about tariff action disrupting permanently American markets, especially for soy and for soybeans and corn. That first round had devastating effects on our market. How is the second round landing, Gary? What are you seeing, and what concerns do your members have at the Minnesota Farmers Union about their markets going forward?
Well, the second round of tariffs from the administration couldn't come at a worse time. Right now, the farmers, are dealing with high input costs and low commodity prices. So, farmers really haven't recovered from this first round. This first round of damage, take soybeans for example. We were China's number one supplier of soybeans. Brazil has replaced us, and that has largely been due to the tariffs. And even though as you go through it, in destroying our trust as a reliable trading partner, that's the damage that'll last us for a long time. In the United States, we're in Minnesota, in the United States, we're fortunate enough. We raise more than we can consume domestically, whether it's crops or livestock. We do have to rely on exports, and we take an example too. We had in his first term, he renegotiated the NAFTA agreement to the USMCA. Well, now all of a sudden that's not good enough. He criticized that. So, as you're working trying to get trade agreements amongst all these countries, it's really destroying our trust as a reliable trading partner, and that's going to hang on there. As he's got frameworks and deals that he's, saying he's going to get done. But even if he can get that done, there's still going to be these other countries are still going to be looking for other sources to supply their needs because they can't trust us. You talked about, Jason mentioned the trade deficits and stuff with various countries. You take Canada, for example, they have about 40 million people. That's the size of California. So they don't have the buying power. So it'll be hard to not have a trade deficit with them. So, you got to bring it back to reality. And, it maybe sounds tough and that he's doing all this stuff, but, really farmers in all respects have not recovered from the reverse trade war. And this is putting us in another worse position again and in primarily destroying our trust as a reliable trading partner as he tries to get these deals done. And I still question, even if he gets deals done, that's still the other country is still going to be looking elsewhere for more secure of their needs.
Yeah, Gary, I want to just do a quick follow-up right away with you, which is, do the last time in the last go around, there was a tremendous amount of money that was spent basically providing trade relief to American farmers. In fact, if you look at what he collected in tariffs and you measure that against what he spent basically subsidizing farmers as a result of their loss in markets, he didn't have a big money raising effort there. So are farmers in your area just saying, don't worry, it'll come back? Or are they saying whatever economic consequences, we'll get a bailout? And whatever comes back, whenever Trump wins, that market will come back. Is that kind of the attitude? politically?
Yeah, I think that the present that attitude is out there, but I mean, there's still some that are concerned. The previous time he gave a $28 billion market facilitation payment, but that's not sustainable because even with that payment, it didn't make the farmers whole. So I think there's a certain amount of farmers that still feel this way, that that'll work out, and they got bailed out once before. But there's other parts of our economy that didn't get bailed out. There's other people, the consumers, that got hurt too. So that is not a sustainable long-term project. And as we try and get our fiscal house in order, which I believe they took a step backwards with their big bill that they just passed. But I think a lot of that, whether that's bill or this stuff, until it really hits, a lot of people are on the sidelines and say, well, until it hits them personally, they're just kind of taking that wait and see attitude. But there are more and more people are starting to get concerned.
And especially, and I know, because we live this every day for our American agriculture. Times are tough out there. Market prices are not what they were the last time we went around. And so this challenge that we're going to have going forward. So I mean, we could spend all of our time talking about the impact on agriculture, but we also want to spend some time to talk about Peter. We're going to call on you. Thank you for joining us. China is investing in what will become the world's largest export terminal in Brazil. It's one of the significant port developments happening in the global south. Do you, when you look at this and when you give talks and you're asked to kind of give some assurances, do you see that the transition basically as a permanent alignment or as a stopgap against what's happening right now with tariffs?
Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. This is very timely and but not unprecedented in the history of the AgTC. Our founding mantra was, there's nothing we produce in agriculture or forest products in this country that cannot be sourced somewhere else in the world. And if we don't deliver it affordably, dependably, our customers overseas will find those other sources. And that was 26 years ago, was our mantra. And so a lot of what we're talking about already on this call, but generally, 2.5 decades ago, we also had these same concerns. This is not all of a sudden that Brazil is taking a lot of our soybean and cotton and beef and pork markets away. They've been doing that for quite a while. So this is not all due to the latest crisis, which happens to be the tariffs. This has been the case for quite a while. And our concern is, can we deliver it affordably, dependably? Does our rail, does our trucking, do our ports, and do the ocean carriers all serve the interests of U.S. agriculture and forest products exports? And we have a couple. I mean, and has been certainly disruptive. If we began, we talked about a little bit, but the China 301, the Trump Biden China 301 tariffs that have been in place, and everybody forgets that they expired. Trump did it first term, very disruptive. Our biggest market for soybeans, was almost taken away at first in President Trump's first term. But that expired in the middle of President Biden's term, and he could have just let them expire, but he didn't. He renewed them, so we're actually living under them now. But he renewed those tariffs and actually made it tougher by eliminating the exclusion. So we had the Trump Biden 301. And now we've got another one that's purely a transportation issue, which is a Biden-Trump initiative, and that's to try to resuscitate the U.S. shipbuilding industry, unfortunately ill-conceived by both the Biden and the Trump administrations thus far, to penalize that any Chinese built ship or Chinese owned ship calling on US ports. Significant fees being imposed on those. And that's significant because about 45% of the container ships, and we move our agriculture that we're speaking about, not only by bulk, but by container, from all parts of the United States to all parts of the world. And those ships, when they come into US ports now, if this is implemented in October as scheduled, will cause great competitive disadvantage to US agriculture exports, because no other country is proposing to impose fees on about 46% of all the container ships in the world, which are built in China. And that number is going up each year because they are building about 85 to 87% of all the container ships being built in the world are built in China. They build them bigger, better, faster, cheaper. And then we have two of the approximately 11 major steamship lines in the world that carry containers to and from the United States, containers of cargo in and out, are Chinese. Costco is Chinese government, and OOCL, which they don't really want to be Chinese, but they're Hong Kong. It's a Hong Kong company, and they're still there. And so we're imposing penalties on moving our exports and imports, but moving our exports of agriculture, forest products from the United States by imposing these fees. Those fees are not being considered by any other country. That's only for cargo moving from the United States outbound to Asia and other places where our agriculture and forest products go. And so we're imposing those fees. Very detrimental and ill-conceived. The U.S. Trade Representative has proposed that. And that's a joint Biden-Trump thing. We were hoping that when Trump came in, he would discard it because it was Biden's, but he didn't. He embraced it, and he's moved forward with it. So we're worried about that. So I think a lot of us don't see this as partisan and so forth, because we think these nobody's got a monopoly on bad ideas when it comes to transport of our products,
Yeah.
which, as I said, all can be replaced. Now, what Brazil has done, and I guess that's what happens if you mow down tens of thousands of acres of rainforest. You've got a lot more land to grow cotton and soybeans, and then to raise the protein. And that was starting some time ago. But in recent years, the decimation of the rainforest has accelerated, and that has all been converted into land that is used to produce products that we have had a dominant position in, but no longer. Soybeans being one, and pork is another, and cotton's another, beef is another. That's one. Two, China has been very aggressive in building infrastructure to serve its needs, and whether that infrastructure is in China or more likely around the world, such as you mentioned, Senator, a major infrastructure in Brazil, but also in Peru. They are building major infrastructure everywhere. So that's another one. Another thing that we're facing, a competitive disadvantage, is that we have restrictions on our ports. They can't be automated. It's due to various labor negotiations, longshore negotiations we don't need to go into, but we do not have automated ports in this country, where other countries are building plenty of ports that are automated and can load containers faster. And those are going into places that have been previously well behind us when it comes to modern infrastructure, such as Brazil, sort of leapfrogging over us. So all those are challenges that we face. Um, the Canadian ports are growing. The West Coast Canadian ports are growing. So a lot of that product coming from North Dakota, Minnesota, goes by the Canadian rail now, and it goes out to Prince Rupert and Vancouver, and those ports are growing fast. So fortunately, we have some expansion, but we don't really have much expansion space on the U.S. West Coast. And our largest ag export markets are Asia Pacific and increasingly India.
Peter, I think it's really, you make really good points, which is, and Jason, you might laugh at this. I once gave a speech saying, what's the difference between America First and Buy America, which was, Biden's mantra. And so there's a growing, there was a growing movement towards globalization in this country. We saw that we could produce higher value goods. We haven't even talked about services as an export in America, which is a high value export. Haven't talked about the balance of trade. Trump only looks at goods, and that this isn't always just a partisan issue. That in fact, the Democratic Party historically has been the protectionist party, and the Republican Party has been the party of open trade, moving forward. So I think you make a really important point. I also want to add that we spent a lot of time talking about agriculture, but when I was in the Senate, the first go around of the tariffs actually hurt small manufacturers in North Dakota it was a tough deal because all of a sudden their inputs, which was steel and aluminum, were costing 25-30% more, and they couldn't compete with cheaper imports for manufactured goods. And so, we can't just focus on agricultural products when we're looking at kind of where we go forward. But Mike, I want to turn to you because that tariffs aren't just the only kind of provision as it relates to export assistance. And so you and I, both lovers of the Export-Import Bank. I served as chair of their advisory group, and you were on the advisory board with me. I think you still are. Want to talk a little bit, have you talk about what the Export-Import Bank does, and have you seen any changes in, kind of how they're approaching, providing assistance and encouraging more exports out of the United States?
Well, good morning, Heidi. Thank you so much for inviting me to this particular panel. And I thank OCP for putting on this seminar. I'd like to correct you on one thing. I got a letter February 1st, 2025, as I suspect most of us did, on the Biden era Exim Bank Board of Advisors. And the letter basically said, thank you for your service. We'll call you when we need you. So
okay.
That letter was not unexpected, and it's all good. Particularly because I think that the Export-Import Bank, particularly in this environment, this high-risk environment that our presenters have adequately described, it's at this juncture where the Export-Import Bank is needed. So the Export-Import Bank is the nation's official export credit agency. And the mission of the Export-Import Bank originally and today is to support the growth of U.S. jobs by facilitating the financing of American exports. And they do this through a number of facilities, direct loans, but more often than usual, they support export financing through guaranteed loans, working capital, insurance, advice, and a number of ways that they do that. And it's so necessary today because all of our presenters before me described the trade war as a high-risk environment. And it's an environment such as this one that the U.S. Import Bank was created. Because in a high-risk environment, we often find that local lenders and commercial lenders don't want to enter the fray of a high-risk environment. And so they're usually unwilling or unable to lend the kind of funds needed to support the U.S. American exports. And so they don't. So the U.S. Export-Import Bank, according to its original mission, comes in to Heidi as a backstop, as a safety net to offer the farmers, to offer the exporters, U.S. exporters, some solace, some comfort, some security, so they can compete against China, which oftentimes finances its state-supported industries in a way that's unfairly competing against the U.S. exporters. So I think the U.S. Import Bank has a great original purpose, and in the current environment, more than anything else, I hope and wish that it will fulfill this purpose by offering the U.S. exporters another option to have their goods and services financed. I did notice, though, that I believe that President Trump's, to his credit, is maybe stepping up here because, as you know so well, between 2015 and 2019, the U.S. Export-Import Bank was dormant, and it was not working because they didn't have a quorum. So back around 2017, President Trump and his first administration began to take, I guess, renewed interest in the U.S. Export-Import Bank by filling the board of advisors and building the quorum of the commissioners. And so here again, in the last 2 weeks, he's built out the full complement of board members. Now, I noticed that 2 weeks ago, he appointed a new CEO. And so they have at least the personnel and the officials that they need on the board now to begin to look at complex transactions, to combat China and Africa, particularly in the energy sector, and to offer the U.S. exporters, whether they're farmers and non-farmer exporters, the financing that they need, if it's direct loans, credit, or insurance. So they have a role to play. I believe that the Trump administration will consider a renewed emphasis on the original focus and purpose of the Exim Bank. And I'm looking forward here in Mississippi to see what they do.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm going to transition and talk about kind of the theory of the case, because we've heard, that the Department of External Revenue, this was going to be a revenue raiser. It's going to replace the need for income taxes. That's why we were doing tariffs. And then the tariffs were also described as a way to fix a trade deficit, which we've already talked about whether that actually works. When you think about some of these smaller countries, I think of some small country that we import minerals from, who has, they have maybe 10 million people. Well, they aren't going to have the same value of imports into their country. And so using trade deficits to measure the economic impact of the trade relationship is not particularly smart. As we kind of look going forward. But if you think about the theory of this case, and you think about what is the actual goal of this trade policy, is it to realign trade if it were reciprocal tariffs? And this is going to be aimed at you, Jason. He kept saying, well, they tariff us higher. These are going to be reciprocal tariffs. But that's not really what Liberation Day was it? I mean, these tariffs were calculated in a formula that was not consistent with, balancing reciprocal tariff against reciprocal tariff.
It's not clear to me what the goal is. It's clear to me what the impulse is. Impulse is a skepticism of other countries, a belief that trade is zero sum, something that we've heard really convincingly rebutted by everyone in this discussion. And yeah, the tariffs aren't at all reciprocal. Most of these countries that we're considering have very low tariffs against the United States, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% tariffs, and we're doing 10, 20, 30, 40% tariffs against them. Now, they do have all sorts of parts of their markets that are closed. For example, Japan closes off all sorts of agricultural markets to our exporters. And the way to do that is something like the agreement that we had negotiated under President Obama, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we got Japan to open its markets, including to American agricultural exports. We got Vietnam, all sorts of countries in the region on both sides of the Pacific to open up. And we offered some concessions as well, although they were relatively minimal. President Trump took us out of that agreement. By the way, Peter was being bipartisan about a lot of this. President Hillary Clinton would have taken us, had she been president, would have taken us out of it. She told us as well. And, so that is the way, I would move forward, is making the types of deals that genuinely open markets as opposed to what we have here. The other thing, and this is something I was saying before, is you just have to understand what your leverage is. And, we've heard a lot about China from pretty much everyone talking here, and that's for good reason. China actually doesn't play by a lot of the rules. China can be quite abusive, and that's why focusing on China makes sense. But you can't have enough leverage on China if you're also fighting Japan and Korea and other countries around the world at the same time. We need to make common cause with these countries to isolate China and try to rewrite those rules in a better way, rather than thinking the United States is big and powerful enough to take on the entire world simultaneously.
Exports to the United States from China is what, 2 or 3% of Chinese GDP, right? So, I mean, I think we have this sense that that the Chinese are heavily dependent on American consumers. That may not be kind of the path forward. And the more we alienate, and I want to talk to you, Gary, about this, the more we alienate our traditional trading partners and create a relationship that is hostile and not trustworthy, the more difficult repairing these relationships after, to the extent that we are going to go back to an era where we look at trade and open trade as a favorable thing for American manufacturers, for American consumers. That's always been good for American consumers, in our opinion. Bringing back manufacturing, bringing back production. What is the biggest concern that you have beyond China in terms of agricultural repairing our relationship with our traditional trading partners?
The uncertainty of how this is going forward, and I gave the example before. He renegotiated NAFTA now in his first term. In the second term, all of a sudden he criticized it. So how do you rebuild that trust? A lot of times I'll think of it, as a farmer or a businessman, if you have a good relationship with your neighbors or your family. If you have a bad relationship, you always lose a little bit of trust. And I just think it's going to be hard. It's going to take a long time to rebuild that trust with other countries. And that even though right now he's got framework on a few, and even though he's able to get a few trade deals done, they're still going to be looking. They're going to be looking for other avenues to supply their needs too, even though they have a trade agreement. We've lost our trust, and once you lose your trust, it takes a long time to repair that. And I think that's the biggest fear that I have as a farmer and representing farmers and rural communities. Going, how long will this last? The president's term will be over, but as we lose our trust as a trading partner, that's going to take a long time to rebuild, and that I think is a big concern for our whole economy.
We talk frequently about the trade embargo, the wheat embargo that Jimmy Carter imposed on Russia. We never got that market back. Right. And so, I think, Mike, you have a comment about kind of how do we as Americans, never mind the administration, send the right signals, I think, about, kind of our trustworthiness as a people, as a community, not just the administration.
I wanted to weigh into this particular conversation because you mentioned what was done in a different era. We're living in a different time with a different leader. But what Gary said about trust really really hit me, because in the era that I was Secretary of Agriculture, this is 93, 94 time period, that was in the latter stages of the Uruguay round of GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. And I asked President Clinton to cede to me the portfolio for all of U.S. agriculture. And he did that. As I went around the world, whether the negotiation was bilateral or multilateral, there were rules of the road. There were no unilateral impositions of tariffs. I mean, there were tariffs, but the tariffs were negotiated between willing partners, 3%, 4%, 5%. And you couldn't treat third world countries like first world countries, right? The third world countries needed to have the time to build the capacity of their farm sector. And so you sort of reduced the tariffs that they were subjected to. But it was all done within a formula. And the formula was based primarily on open markets. If you have open markets and the movement of the goods and services is responsive to consumer desires, and the country that was more efficient, that produced the products that the consumers desired, well, then they were going to win. And so the government negotiated lower tariffs and just got out of the way. And we did it three ways. The tariffs were predictable. I mean, there were tariffs, but they weren't inordinate like we have now. And number two, we tried to ensure the open market by reining in the export subsidies and the domestic exports. Then thirdly, you talked about IEEA a minute ago. Back then, we had a robust WTO. So we had an entity that you could go to negotiate dispute mechanisms. And so we had this framework of three things we could use to facilitate an open market, and that built the trust that we needed and that we need today.
I think everybody should kind of think about agriculture maybe different from, whether you're going to import a Huffy bike or a bicycle. Countries are going to be more protectionist based on their ability to feed their people because they don't want that vulnerability. And so when you look at vulnerabilities that countries feel, and one of the things that shocked me is the high level of barriers that India had for a lot of pulse crops, which is they're a huge consumer, but we weren't given access to those markets. North Dakota is number one on a lot of pulse crops. And when I looked at kind of trade barriers, everybody's talking about China. I'm talking about India. Man, we would love to send, beans and peas and lentils, but India is going to be. Plus, they have a very politically astute farmer political voting bloc, and you saw some of the rebellion there. And so, every country is going to have their own sensitivities. And I think you might just laid it out that if you aren't having those conversations about trustworthiness, I think it's pretty hard for countries to become reliant. And Peter, I want to turn to you because I find this discussion about transportation really fascinating, because it's not just agriculture as you've outlined. It's the ability of long term for America to export their products and to basically move their products in and out of our ports. And what you said earlier is we're falling behind, and obviously, there's a lot of political ramifications, and you see it on both sides of the aisle. How do you see that getting fixed in terms of access to lower cost methods of transportation.
So I thank you very much, and I'm sorry that delay. Yes, more lower cost, more efficient. And what we found when we were trying to do something about it, we moved the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. And what became very evident, because we're talking about why the emphasis on agriculture, I guess I could return that question, and you know the answer. Uh, Everybody, importers, exporters, Walmart, Amazon, everybody wanted to change the ocean shipping laws that we have and regulations a little bit, but it was actually a Democrat from Central Valley, California, uh, Garamendi, and a Republican, Dusty Johnson from North Dakota,
South Dakota.
South Dakota. Sorry, big, big, big error there. South Dakota. The two of them moved forward with Ocean Shipping Reform Act. They introduced it. They got it passed through the House 3 times. Went over to the Senate, and Maria Cantwell, Washington State, really took the lead there because of her position on the Commerce Committee and agriculture dependent. And, you know, we heard from virtually every member of Congress about their farmers. I had to go look for the farmers in Rhode Island, but there are, believe it. But every member wanted to talk about their farmers. Nobody wanted to talk about Amazon or Walmart or and so forth. So we took that, and some people ask why that legislation seems to be more oriented to agriculture and forest products, and that's why everybody wants it. But you raised a very good point. Every country feels that the quintessential net person of that country is a farmer, even though farmers generally are no longer the majority of the population in any country. But in India, the farmers have been very powerful, very inefficient. They're barely over subsistence in many others, but there are a lot of them. And they don't want our almonds to come in and our wheat and our grain and soybeans and so forth. Um, so we have those challenges all over. The French are, even within the European Union, they're just terribly protective of certain sectors. And every country feels it's their right. So we have to work through that. I fully agree. The Trans Pacific Partnership was a fabulous opportunity, and it was stupid by both parties to make it a political football. And we walked away from something that would have achieved a lot. But in terms of changing policies, we're used to it because things change. It was in more recent times that with the overnight delivery and the exemption from tariffs for anything under $800, that China began to ship everything through Mexico, put it in a new package, and bring it right into the U.S. And and so now we still focus on China, but can we differentiate now Vietnam, Japan, and Korea, who have so much of their exports are really Chinese product going their inputs, and that's what held up this Vietnam negotiation was how do you get control of where that product actually comes from. So when we focus on those things, they're constantly changing. And for transportation, it's also a challenge. It's constant disruption for the grains coming from North Dakota, for example. That used to all come Burlington Northern, Union Pacific to the Pacific Northwest, U.S. Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Tacoma, Portland. A lot of it's going by the Canadian National Canadian Pacific to Vancouver and to Prince Rupert. We've got the emergence now of East Coast ports, Savannah and Charleston and Houston, uh, very competitive, without quite the same restrictions, labor, environmental, and so forth. Mobile, Alabama, all those. to serve growing markets around the world. And then we have for transportation, and here's the challenge, India is now emerging into global commerce. They are opening their market a little bit. And there's so many people there, and they're getting wealthier as a country. So we have to have transportation that goes there. So you've got product that starts, let's say the product starts in North Dakota. A lot of our members are there, and soybeans. Which way do you go? Do you go east? Do you go west? Do our railroads both go east and west equally? No, they don't. You've got railroads that we've mentioned, our class 1 railroads on the western go west, the eastern go east. We don't have a national that goes all the way across. Makes it for a major challenge. There are things that we need to do with our own infrastructure, our own organization, and our own rules to combat some of these things that are unfair. Japan, they need rice, but they won't buy as much of our rice as we would like to sell them, even if it's a Japanese company growing it on land that they own in California. They still limit how much they can get. So those are restrictions, and we're kind of glad to see any president, we don't care which one, try to knock down some of these unfair barriers. But the fact is, the world is changing very fast, and we see it with transportation, where we have to reroute to compete with other emerging countries. Australia, we used to be the only place in the world where you can get, it was contrary to our mantra, the only place you could get quantity and quality of almonds was California's Central Valley. Not anymore. Australia is producing quality and quantity and does not have the trade restrictions, tariffs between itself and India that we have. So everything's changing. And I think for transportation, it's a constant battle and redeployment of assets, both domestic and international. And finally, we have self-imposed on transportation. Fortunately, North Dakota is one of the good thinkers on this. We have the lowest allowable truck weight in the world, in the entire world. Nobody limits truck weights, gross truck weights, to 80,000 pounds, except the United States. Canada is 105,000, Mexico, Europe, 105,500, which means for every truckload that they send of soybeans from Canada to a port, we have to send 2 truckloads. 2 trucks, 2 drivers, twice the expense. That is a self-imposed calamity only in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and it's gradually coming. North Dakota actually has a higher number for some of the sugar beets, but we can solve a lot of our problems ourselves without complaining about politicians doing whatever politicians do. There are things that you try to get it away from just these trade agreements. Just what can we as Americans do? We can eliminate our self-imposed deficiencies in transportation. If you got it, a truck brought it, so wherever it goes, but we have penalized ourselves. California being the worst is sort of a barrier to transportation.
So Jason, let's just close out with some dialogue on macro kind of impacts, because we've talked a lot about trade and what that means. There's a lot of questions coming in the chat that basically, how does all of this affect long-term GDP for this country, and short-term GDP? And you already, I think, addressed short-term GDP, but we've talked a little bit about these multilateral trade agreements. And I was one of the few people, and didn't make a lot of my manufacturing unions very happy with me. But I said, look, we're a country of 330 million people. If you think that we're going to be successful only selling to ourselves, that's just not going to work. And so TPP, I mean, I don't hear anybody talking about a multilateral agreement anymore. I mean, and some of these bilaterals, I wonder if they're going to have to be approved by Congress. No one's even talked about that. As Trump goes through and negotiates these trade agreements, are they considered bilaterals that need approval, or are they just kind of some temporary understanding? And what does that mean long term? As we look at kind of the change in demographics, the change in the specialization, AI, robotics, what concerns you the most about what's happening right now with trade policy and what that means for the future of this country economically?
So the first thing to understand is that when you put a tariff, you think you're just taxing imports. By the way, you're taxing, for the most part, the Americans who buy those imports, but you think that's what you're doing. You're also taxing your exports. And we've heard a lot of that over this conversation. That might be because other countries retaliate against our tariffs. That might be because of the transportation that you need becomes more expensive. That might be because you put tariffs on industrial equipment or inputs like steel that you need to use to make cars. And so every time we make imports more expensive, we also make it harder and more difficult to export things as well. And that's important because the economy is just increasingly, the global economy, just very, very specialized. I mean, there are very few products that we can make from beginning to end. And there's very few products that we would want to make from beginning to end. What we want to do is the highest value added, the highest wage, the things that we're best suited to, and leave the assembly line where you're just screwing in little screws over and over again for 12-hour shifts. Leave that to another country. Those aren't the jobs that we want. We want the really good jobs, the really high-paid jobs. And so what all of this threatens to do is to reduce some of that division of labor, leave us with more of the bad jobs, maybe even making T-shirts and shoes, not just screws on iPhones. But that means we'll have fewer of the good jobs. And so over time, lower economic growth, lower wages, less ability to succeed in the global economy. And by the way, other countries aren't doing this. We've heard a lot in this discussion about China helping to build ports in Brazil, for example. Other countries are trying to fill in the slack that the United States is creating. And so, for the most part, less trade means a poorer world as a whole, but we'll get the worst end of that deal the way we've been approaching this.
So in the past, Jason, our policy really has been to go after high value, leave lower value, high labor intensity jobs that even we can't fill. We don't have the workforce to fill a lot of those, but taking a look at how to bring our economy into the highest value added in terms of our productivity and our inputs. And so what you're suggesting is that right now, if we continue down this path, we may in fact be bringing back jobs or being, incentivizing an economy that is a lower value, lower productivity economy. Is that what?
That is exactly right. And it's exactly the wrong thing to be doing.
I mean, and we haven't even had a chance to talk about services, which I have an old story about your former boss, Bill Clinton, Mike. I was on the trade advisory group, and I'm a lot. I mean, I fought NAFTA, I fought the WTO, because they aren't a very good policeman for trade. But at the end of the day, I remember a guy who was in financial services because I was complaining about my farmers, and he just looked at me and he goes, there's going to be winners and losers, and you want us to win, and it's okay if you lose. And I'm like, well, no, it's really not. But I think that's one of the problems, is that this is never perceived in this country as a zero-sum game. That we have to give up something in order to get, a higher value, and everybody wants to hang on to everything. And I think that's the administration's thinking, is that, we've got to maintain I mean, we've got to bring back all these jobs, and everybody is going to, of course, want access to the American market. Makes sense. We're a huge part of global GDP, but that's not always going to be true. And certainly not going to be true if we don't see population growth. So these are all challenges. And Jason, I have to indulge just one additional economic question before we sign off. And it's about modern monetary theory, which is my least favorite economic theory. And talking about debt and deficit, and do they really matter? Because there's a whole school of economic thought that they don't, and that you can be any rise of the American debt against GDP doesn't really matter, because we're still the reserve currency and we're still dominant economically. So can you just respond to our listener who wants to know what your opinion is about modern monetary theory?
Yeah, it is definitely my least favorite idea. I think it's more of a political movement than it is an economic theory. And the United States faces constraints on our borrowing. We see that interest rates now are a lot higher than they were a couple of years ago. Why is that? Well, a lot of that is that we're borrowing a lot more. And I expect the borrowing that we're doing over the next decade to increase interest rates still further. It's true the United States doesn't need to default on its debt because we can always print money. But if we print money, and this is something Donald Trump has basically been calling to do, then we'll just get a big burst of inflation. And so, yeah, we paid off our debt, but we paid it with money and paper that isn't worth very much. And the whole reason the dollar has been what it is, the whole reason we can borrow the way we can borrow from the rest of the world, is that people believe that we will not do that. They believe that we'll keep inflation under control, and the debt is a really big threat to continuing to do that.
We saw some of that with the bond market. I mean, the original ratcheting back of Liberation Day was driven by threats from the bond market, and so they're intertwined with the trade discussion that we're having. And the big beautiful bill is a budget buster, and so at some point, I just want to close out with my question to you, Jason, which is, if is at some point, will this bill exacerbate the problem of being able to market American debt?
Absolutely. I mean, we're doing a pretty amazing experiment right now. If you look at the deficit as a share of the economy, that's the way economists do it, so you can compare it over time. It's more than 6% of GDP right now. That is larger than any time in our history except World War II, the financial crisis, and COVID. There were good reasons for borrowing all those times. There is not a good reason to borrow right now. And now that we passed this law, that deficit is likely to go up relative to our economy, not down. I don't think there's going to be a crisis where we literally can't borrow anything. We're just going to have to pay more for that borrowing. And when you pay more for that borrowing, then your deficit and debt go up more quickly. And then, by the way, you have to pay even more for the borrowing, and you end up in the type of cycle that we'd really very much like to avoid being in.
Well, and borrowers or people who would buy our debt, if I'm doing it, I'm not doing it right now. I'm going to wait to see how much I'm going to get going forward. How desperate the country is going to get. So these are all intertwined, and I want to thank this amazing group of specialists and professionals for joining us here at One Country. I hope that you've enjoyed the dialogue. We could have spent another couple hours talking about all of the impacts, but something to watch kind of going forward, and not forget that this adds to the economic challenges as tariffs affect American businesses. The uncertainty of tariffs affect American businesses. That adds to our economic challenge, but it also adds to the fiscal and monetary challenges that we have in monitoring this economy. And you see that right now with Jerome Powell Powell basically saying, I'm going to hold off because I don't know what this means. Now he seems more willing to lower interest rates, but who knows what the big, beautiful bill is going to do to drive interest rates up, and how much control does the Fed ultimately actually have in terms of consumer. And just to remind everybody, we have record consumer debt. Never mind our sovereign debt in this country. We have record consumer debt today in America. And so we're putting a lot on the credit card, and we're counting on the rest of the country, rest of the world to help us finance the opportunities. So want to thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye, guys.